Hello, everyone.
Hello. The last segment was about Revelation 7, the 144,000 and the great crowd, the standard proof text the Watchtower uses. This one is used a little less prominently than the other one in terms of identifying who these ones are. We saw in the last segment that the 144,000 were not seen in Revelation 7. Their number is heard and their tribal attachment is heard. The only group that's seen is the great crowd, but here things change. So why don't we read chapter 14, 1 to 5, just the segment on the great crowd. On the 144,000 itself.
Okay. And I saw and look, the Lamb, standing upon the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound out of heaven, as the sound of many waters, and as the sound of loud thunder. And the sound that I heard was as of singers, who accompany themselves on the harp, playing on their harps. And they are singing as if a new song, before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one was able to master that song but the 144,000 who have been bought from the earth. These are the ones that did not defile themselves with women. In fact, they are virgins. These are the ones that keep following the Lamb, no matter where he goes. These were bought from among mankind as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. And no falsehood was found in their mouths. They are without blemish.
I guess we should look first at the assumptions we make if we're Jehovah's Witnesses, starting with the number itself. It's never questioned if you're a Jehovah's Witness whether this is literally 144,000 persons or not.
No.
Although gender is certainly not literal, is it?
No.
In that they are very plainly males in this vision.
And virgins.
But in the application the Watchtower makes, they're men and women.
Mm-hmm.
But the number is literal.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that just before that, in chapter 13, verse 18, the segment where you have the 2 beasts talked about, the beast and the image of the beast, there is a number given in verse 18, which is the number 666. And the Watchtower doesn't take that number literally, although much of Christendom does, and say that it's actually the literal number that is gematria, the number equivalent of the Hebrew or Greek or Latin letters. That's taken literally as a literal number, not necessarily literally written on people's heads, although in those days slaves generally did have a literal name or number branded on their hand or their forehead. But most people don't take that part literally, but do take the number seriously and literally. The Watchtower takes this one symbolically as representative of the fallenness of man, 666 being short of 7, obviously, and emphatically because it's mentioned 3 times. So they take this symbolically, but then the very next number that occurs a verse later is literal.
So it's depending on their desire or the way they think it can fit into a scenario that they have, whether or not it's symbolic or literal. And the average witness never even notices that things are switching back and forth. It's very Humpty Dumpty.
Yeah, and of course when you see as a Jehovah's Witness on Mount Zion in verse 1, you take that symbolically. That's heavenly Zion, right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of Christians who believe that too, that we're talking here about what Hebrews 12 talks about, the saints have approached heavenly Jerusalem. But of course in the text it doesn't say heavenly, does it? It says Mount Zion.
But there is one verse that tells you for sure it's not about Jehovah's Witnesses. I would say verse 5. And no falsehood was found in their mouths. They are without blemish. Well, you can rule out that it's about Jehovah's Witnesses.
This is a reference, it would seem, to Zephaniah chapter 3, which we'll get to in a minute. So yeah, I would say definitely not Jehovah's Witnesses based on their history. They're certainly not blameless. But I think we should pay even more attention to the flip-flop back and forth in terms of the way they apply this section. So the geography is not literal. Mount Zion they take as being definitely a reference to heavenly Zion. Christians are divided on that. Some take it quite literally and think this is the return of Christ to the earth, him standing on Mount Zion with a remnant of faithful Jews. So they would take 144,000 here in the same way chapter 7 does, as the remnant, the faithful remnant of Israel, and that would connect with Zephaniah 3, because if you read the text of Zephaniah 3, and we'll link a video that we've done on this to this video, if you read the text of Zephaniah 3, it's definitely about the faithful remnant, and the aspect you just brought out about them being, in the New World Translation, they don't have a tricky tongue, deceptive tongue, and that seems to be a direct reference to it here in verse 5. Are they before the throne? Now there's Christians dispute this one too, that in verse 3 they say, well, they're singing a new song before the throne, so it can't be literal earth, some Christians would say. Yeah, but there's no direct link between verse 1 and verse 3. If there is, it's maybe ambiguous. Is the throne on earth? And in which case it would represent the throne in heaven. So even this remnant, if it is a remnant of faithful Jews, at this point, are they transported to heaven? And in which case, what time is this in history? Well, it's during the seventh trumpet, if you go back to chapter 11, verse 15. This is all happening at the very end, during the seventh trumpet. Now, it does say in verse 3b that they're redeemed from the earth. So I would tend to think, at this point at least, the 144,000 faithful Israelites, and if you're leaning towards literal Israelites as opposed to spiritual Israelites, they're gathered or sealed during this period, according again to chapter 7.
Bought from the earth.
But in chapter 7 they're still on the earth, being protected, but here they're in heaven. That makes sense, but we shouldn't be dogmatic about it, right?
Yeah, I don't think we should be dogmatic about anything in Revelation.
And then in verse 4, they haven't defiled themselves with women, they are virgins. So there are some who believe that's literal. This is 144,000 literal virgin Jews, males. But the great majority of commentators just say, no, it's talking about their spiritual virginity. They have not defiled themselves. Well, women in the book of Revelation occurs, of course, later on, refers to spiritual harlotry. When we get to Babylon the Great, in the very next section, that becomes relevant, doesn't it? So they're not literal virgins according to the Watchtower?
No, according to the Watchtower, it's spiritual.
But they are redeemed from mankind, and at this point in heaven. So for some reason, this is where they get their idea that the 144,000 are a heavenly class, that they're literally before the throne, whereas the great crowd in chapter 7 are not literally before the throne.
And I think it comes down to Rutherford needing to get more numbers somewhere, because with thinking there was only going to be 144,000 going to heaven, they were running into trouble now. Too many people.
Right, and to some extent that's buttressed by the end of verse 4, right? That these are first fruits redeemed from mankind, therefore in contrast to the great crowd that are met with not just in chapter 7 but chapter 19. A great crowd from all tribes and nations and languages, but these ones are the first fruits. So that tends to support the idea of a faithful Jewish remnant. Although I, again, wouldn't want to be dogmatic.
And when you think about the early church, they were all Jewish, so, the first fruits were Jewish.
Yeah.
In that sense, they were first fruits.
Now, this is all linked, all of this stuff we're talking about is linked to the fall of Babylon, which is in the very next section of Revelation. And then to what we could call the Armageddon scenario, which is in the last third of the chapter, starting at verse 14. So in the next segment, we want to talk about those two connections that are made here and where they sit in time, because after all, we're still in the seventh trumpet at this point, and although Babylon is seen more completely in chapters 17 and 18, during the seventh bowl, the very last judgments, its first mention is in the next section. So we'll deal with that in the next segment. And we'll attach to this one the connections to the Zephaniah video, and also Daniel 11 and 12. So we do want to make the point that a lot of the scenario here seems to be connected most directly to Daniel 11 and 12, where you have the king of the north, usually called the Antichrist or the man of lawlessness, setting up his tent between the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Holy Mountain. So here, is it a coincidence we have the Holy Mountain mentioned? And we have a faithful remnant mentioned in Daniel chapter 12 that are the wise, that will go about taking the knowledge, the truth about the events, the correct interpretation of these events to the many. A faithful remnant of Jews who will be preserved through the tribulation period. And we also have in Daniel 12 the first reference to the Great Tribulation, where all of this is set. So we'll put the links to Daniel 11, 12 videos plus the Zephaniah one, and in the next video we'll be discussing specifically the connection with the fall of Babylon and the Armageddon harvest of the earth in the rest of chapter 14.